So I want to talk about heuristics and consumer choice. The consumer choice problem is this, which you know from economics. To do this, you make choices. The choices require information, and there's two types of information that become important as you're making consumer choices. One is external information, that is information about the attributes of the things that you're thinking about consuming, about purchasing. In that, we kind of think about, when you talk in economics about homogeneous products and heterogeneous products, it's this that you're talking about. What are the attributes of these things that we're facing with, that we could possibly consume? The other piece of information that we don't talk nearly as much about is internal information. That is our attitudes toward these attributes. We kind of take this as a given when we talk about things like utility maximization. You say, well, if I consume a slice of pizza, it gives me so much happiness. What we tend not to talk about is the very real thing that people don't always know ahead of time how much happiness something will bring them. You have some kind of idea and you say, yeah, generally I like pizza, but if you've ever had the experience of you order something, let's stick with food, you order something to eat knowing that this is going to be a good thing, and you try it and you think, oh my God, this is incredible, right? That reaction is not simply the attributes of the thing you're consuming, it's also your own reaction to this. So these two types of information become important. Information about the thing that you're consuming, the external information, and information about your own reactions, the internal information. So as you think about this, in a principles level econ course, we would talk about maximizing expected happiness. We'd say something like, okay, there's this thing. You can buy a movie ticket and go to the movies, get popcorn, the whole thing costs you $12, and it brings you a certain amount of happiness on this happiness scale of sad to moderate to happy. And then you think to yourself, well, what else could I do with that $12? I could purchase, a meal at McDonald's and spend the same $12. And you think about how much happiness those two things will bring you, and you come to some conclusion and you say, yeah, the movie ticket brings me more happiness, so that's the thing I buy, right? And we have all kinds of things we use in economics tools to describe how you go about making that decision. But at its basis, that's what you've done. You said, here are the attributes of things in front of me. I picked the one that's going to bring me, for the price, the most happiness. So here's the question. What happens if the information about the product, or maybe the information about yourself, your own reaction to the product, what happens if that information is absent? You don't know. Maybe you'll get more happiness from this movie. Maybe you'll get less happiness, right? You have some kind of idea of what kind of happiness you're going to get, but it's fuzzy because you're not entirely sure how much happiness you'll get. So too with the meal at McDonald's, right? It's going to bring you some happiness. Maybe it'll be a lot, maybe it'll be a little. You're not certain exactly how much happiness. And because the information is fuzzy, it becomes harder to make a decision here. It's not entirely clear all the time what it is you should do. And I'm sure every one of you has had this experience. If you've ever, let's say you got $20 in your pocket and you go to the mall, you're going to spend the day, hanging out, doing whatever you do at the mall, and you see something that catches your eye and you think to yourself, should I buy this thing? And maybe you go back and forth about it, right? So maybe you say, well, all right, I'm not going to buy this. And you go away and you think about it and you come back and maybe say, okay, well, maybe I will buy this. You're doing this thing that you see on this picture. It's not entirely clear to you how much happiness this thing will bring you. So you're thinking about it, you're weighing it, you're getting a gut reaction, trying to figure out what consumer choice decision you should make. Now, in perfectly competitive markets, in monopoly markets, consumer choice is easy, right? Because in perfect competition, the goods are all the same. We use the term homogeneous. The attributes are all the same, the prices are the same. So if you've got one thing, you've got 87 octane gas is the same as 87 octane gas. It doesn't matter. They're identical. Now, be careful, because when you go to buy gas, you sometimes have preferences, right? You go to this gas station versus that one. But if you think about your decision, you aren't making the decision on the basis of the gas. 87 octane gas is 87 octane gas. You're making it on the basis of other things, like this place has particularly good coffee, or this place doesn't, or this place is, half a mile further out of my way, and this one isn't. So you are making a choice, but you're tending to make the choice on things that have something that deal with something other than the gas. When it comes to the gas, the homogeneous product, 87 octane gas is 87 octane gas. And so it becomes very easy, if you're talking about just the gasoline, it becomes very easy to think about consumer choice. So too, if you're talking about a monopoly, it becomes pretty easy to think about consumer choice because there aren't competing things, right? So if you're the only internet service provider you have is Xfinity, there's not much to think about here. It basically boils down to, do you want internet service or don't you? And that's your choice. There's not a lot of things to weigh. But here's the thing. Perfectly competitive markets and monopoly markets are minority markets, in the sense of that's not what most markets are. Most markets are monopolistically competitive. In monopolistically competitive markets, there's some heterogeneity. The goods aren't exactly the same. There's differences amongst them. So this brand of pizza is slightly different from that brand of pizza, and this pair of shoes is different from that pair of shoes. And as I think about my consumer choice problem, I now have to weigh the attributes of different goods, and often there are many, many of these things. And so what do you do when you're faced with having to make a choice amongst a bunch of similar, although different goods? You want to make the best choice possible, and yet there's all of these options in front of you. Bernie Sanders did this famous thing of who needs 23 brands of deodorant. Well, but that's kind of what we're getting at here. Faced with 23 brands of deodorant, how do you know which one to buy? And I can ask you, I tell you, every one of you has some particular favorite brand that you buy. But I guarantee you that none of you have made the decision to buy your preferred brand after trying all the other ones. And so every one of us, on the one hand, we made a choice. This is the brand I want. On the other hand, we made it with incomplete information because we don't know the attributes. We haven't tried all of the competing brands. So here we are in this monopolistically competitive market where it's not entirely clear how much happiness a good will bring me. And if I can get more information about the good, if I can try the thing and figure out its attributes and weigh it against other things, then I can make a good decision. So the more information I have, the better decision I can make. But here's the problem. Information is precise. It will tell me this product is better than that product, but it's costly. It's costly to obtain this information. I can rely alternatively on heuristics, which is the topic of this discussion. And the thing about heuristics is they're cheap. They're not expensive like information is, but they come at it with a downside. The downside is that they're imprecise. And so what you will find, the argument I'm going to be making for you here, is that faced with monopolistically competitive markets where we have many, many options that are different from each other in some ways, we will tend to rely on heuristics simply because it's way too expensive in terms of information cost to try and get the information necessary to choose specifically which of the 23 brands of deodorant am I going to buy. And so I use these heuristics, and they aren't perfect. I'll make mistakes with them, but the benefit is they're far less costly to implement than is information. So let's back off a minute and ask the question, why does it matter that decision-making might be costly? And if any of you have ever been in a relationship where you really weren't too happy with this person you're in a relationship with, but you stick it out because the hassle of going out and being single again, then going and dating and finding somebody. The hassle's just too large. You say, heck with that. I'll just deal with this person. That's this. It's a situation in which the cost of the decision making, the cost to arrive at some new decision, is higher than the pain of just dealing with the thing you've got in front of you. So this is why costly decision making matters, because in the face of costly decision making, we can often end up making the wrong decisions. And we have a name for this. It's called rational ignorance. And the ignorance part means that you're making, think of it as you're making a bad decision. A better way to say it is you're ignorant of what's going on here. And I don't mean in the sense of being stupid. I mean in the sense of it's not worth it to you to go out and collect more information, right? How many of you research carefully the pros and cons of different brands of dental floss before buying a packet of dental floss? You don't. You just go and grab whatever's there in the checkout line, right? You might take a few extra seconds to scan the prices and grab the one that's cheaper, but nobody thinks more than 2 seconds about dental floss. So when it comes to purchasing dental floss, we are all ignorant. That is, we're unaware of all of the attributes that these various brands of dental floss have. But although we are ignorant, we are rationally ignorant, meaning it is perfectly rational for us not to be aware of this stuff, because the cost of collecting the information and weighing the pros and the cons of different brands of dental floss, the cost of doing that is higher than what the benefit of doing it is. So it's perfectly rational that we would remain unaware of the differences amongst these brands. And heuristics can help mitigate this decision-making cost. Think about an election. How many of you, of those of you who vote, right? And there are a lot of you who won't vote because the cost of voting is so high, you don't even care, right? But of those of you who do vote, how many of you go and research all of the candidates and their positions on all the various topics? You don't. Nobody does that. I mean, this is kind of my job, thinking about these things, and I don't do it. What do we do instead? Well, we use heuristics, shortcuts. We'll do things like vote for party affiliation. So if you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, you'll go vote for the person who's a Democrat or who is a Republican. You're using that party affiliation as a shortcut. So I don't have to think about this person. I'm just going to say, the person who's belongs to the same party that I'm in, that's who I'm going to vote for. Or you might ask people, you ask your professor, you ask your friends or whatever, who are you voting for? What do you think? And they'll tell you. And if a whole bunch of your friends say, I'm voting for this person, you might go and do that also. You're using your friends' decisions as a heuristic, as a shortcut. Name recognition, same kind of thing. If you've ever noticed at polling places, there are people standing outside handing out, cards and flyers and hats with their candidate's name on it. They're playing off of this heuristic of name recognition. They want their candidate's name to be the last name you heard before you go in that voting booth. And so as you're looking at all the candidates are basically their brands. They're like products, right? You're weighing the pros and cons of different products. Something sticks out. This name, yeah, I heard this somewhere. And so you're not everybody, but enough of us are likely enough to pick it because of name recognition that the name recognition starts to matter. Attractiveness also. Now, nobody's going to admit to this, right? But you will hear, and this happens every time you get an attractive candidate running. So back when Barack Obama was running on his first election, there were a number of people who, when interviewed, would say things. Those, the news people would ask them, who are you voting for? They'd say, well, I think I'm going to vote for Barack Obama. And they'd say, why? And the person would say, well, I like his positions. And the news media person would say, well, tell me some of the positions that you think are good. And some people would be able to answer the question. A lot of people wouldn't be able to answer it. But a lot of people would say things like, well, he's handsome. Right? And so it becomes a heuristic. I'm not saying it's a good heuristic, but it's a heuristic. It's a shortcut that you use to help you make a decision. So here's where we are. we're faced with these products and we don't know exactly what their attributes are. We don't know exactly what our reactions will be. If we could get more information, we could be more certain about what these attributes are and what our reactions will be. And so we could make better decisions. Problem is, the information is expensive. It's cognitively expensive to get this stuff. And so what do? We rely instead on heuristics. And heuristics aren't perfect. We'll end up making some errors, but we'll make fewer errors than if we didn't employ anything at all. The upside to heuristics, they're cheaper. I can simply do things like say, well, what are my friends doing? Or which party does this guy belong to? Or what's the last brand of dental floss I bought? The heuristics are easier to implement. So, relying on heuristics will, not all the time, but it will from time to time, cause you to make poor choices. You'll end up making the wrong decision. Does this mean humans aren't rational? And the answer here is no. Humans are rationally irrational. So we will think more carefully about decisions when the benefit from doing so exceeds the cost. Rationally irrational. Now be careful, because some of us are simply irrational, right? Some of us simply just make random decisions. We make poor decisions on and on. And be careful about this, because people who are skeptical of economics will say things like, well, economics might work in theory, but it doesn't work in the real world because it assumes people are rational. Economics doesn't assume that everybody's rational. It assumes that people are rational on average. So you may be irrational from time to time. Some people may be irrational all the time, but on average, we learn, right? So if you've ever gone to a high school prom, probably half of you, the next day when you realize that, oh my God, this prom cost me $300, and you realize you didn't have that good of a time anyway, and you think to yourself, that was stupid. What did you just do? You just admitted that you made an irrational decision. You shouldn't have gone to the prom. But what else has happened? You learn, and you say, well, I'm not doing that again. People learn. And people who don't learn tend to weed themselves out, either actually weed themselves out because they do stupid things and they die, or they weed themselves out of the markets because they make stupid decisions again and again. And so their economic power, the amount of earnings they have, the amount of money they have able to spend, starts to diminish. So humans tend to be, in the long run, on average, rational. So when are we going to use heuristics if we're going to be rational? Well, we're going to use heuristics when the cost of making the wrong choice is low. So picking up the dental floss, picking up a pack of gum, think about impulse purchases. The cost of being wrong is low. So I'm just going to grab this thing. It's not worth thinking about. If it's wrong, it's wrong. I'll get something different next time. So the cost of making choices is low. We'll tend to use heuristics. We'll also tend to use heuristics when the cost of making the choice is high. So making the wrong choice is low, we'll use heuristics, and making a choice at all is high, we'll use heuristics. Think about buying a car. I'm showing you here a bunch of emblems of a bunch of car manufacturers. Within each emblem, each manufacturer has a whole suite of cars, a fleet. And for each type of car, there are variations, everything from number of cup holders to leather seats to sunroofs to what color paint. And so the number of cars facing you, if you go out into the world and say, okay, it's time to buy a car, the number of options in front of you is probably in the tens of thousands. There's no way. Now, this is an important decision, right? It's not like buying the gum or buying the dental floss. It's an important decision, but there's no way that you can weigh all of the necessary information. It's just too much. If you attempted to do so, you would never buy a car, because by the time you got done analyzing all the versions of cars that are out there, half of them will have been discontinued and replaced with new ones, and you got to start all over again. So this is where we tend to use heuristics. When the cost of making the wrong choice is low, that is, it doesn't matter, or when the cost of making a choice at all is high, That is, I can't deal with 10,000 of these options. I got to do something. And we have a question. Would you say seeking information is always cognitively costly, literally costly, or can be classified as either or? Yeah. And Massimo, the answer is, yeah, it depends. Sometimes the cost of seeking information is strictly cognitive. Sometimes it might be a little bit of cognitive and a lot of expense, dollar expense. Sometimes it might be some combination. But the thing is, as economists, it doesn't matter to us which it is, because from an economic perspective, all that matters is that there's a cost. Now, whether that cost comes in one form of dollars, or the form of time, or the form of effort, doesn't matter. They all impinge on our behavior in the same way. All right, so let's talk about heuristics in the choice process. One of the ways that humans tend to use heuristics is in a two-step process. And this tends to apply, this isn't with the dental floss and the gum, but this kind of thing you'll see with cars, with houses, with colleges, big ticket items where the cost of making a bad decision is huge. But there's so many options in front of you that you simply can't think about every one of them individually. You got to use heuristics. So humans will tend to do this in a two-step process, what we call consideration and choice. And consideration is taking all of the options in front of you and whittling them down. So here we have a whole bunch of colleges. So picture you're a senior in high school, you're thinking about what college you should go to, and there's literally thousands of options in front of you. In the consideration step, what we're going to do is knock that down to some manageable size, and we'll use heuristics to do it. And if you think back to when you chose a college, if you think about it, you did this. You would have done something like you would have said right off, I want to be in a big school, right? I don't want to be in a place where everybody knows my business. Or you might, well, you all are at University of Arizona, so you didn't do the opposite. I did the opposite. I said, I don't want to be, one person in a huge pool of students. I want to, be in a smaller place. So you do this. Students will do this. They'll say, okay, I only want to think about the big colleges. I only want to think about colleges within 100 miles of home. I only want to think about colleges that have a good football program, right? And so what you do is you use heuristics. You're drawing a line in the sand and saying only colleges that live up to this standard, whatever the standard is. And that immediately knocks these down to a manageable set. Once you have the manageable set, you now use choice. And choice is the cognitively expensive thing. You're going to think carefully about these things. So you weigh University of Arizona against Texas Tech, and you look at all sorts of things. You talk to people, maybe you visit the two campuses. You're in the choice stage now. So you use the heuristic to knock your set of possible options down to something manageable, and then you employ choice, which is cognitively expensive to think about these options. So choosing a college is one example. Choosing a car, right? So you might do something like say, look, I want all-wheel drive. I've got to seat at least 8, and it's got to be under $40,000. Okay, you just knocked the set of thousands of cars down to something manageable. Within that manageable set, you can now think carefully about the attributes of the Highlander, the Telluride, the Pilot, and weigh these things. So I'll show you a couple of heuristics, and there's a whole bunch of these that people will use when they're making choices, but I'll show you a couple of heuristics with respect to a couple of things. Think about beer brands first. And what I'm going to do here is draw a map of the consumer's mind. So here's the consumer. He's going out to the store. He's going to buy beer, and he thinks to himself, all right, what do I know? I know that two things matter to me. One is taste, and the other is affordability. So think about taste along one axis and affordability along the other. And I'm aware of, maybe I've had experience with a certain number of brands, and here they are. And I know I've tried Guinness, and Guinness tastes really great, but my God, it's expensive. Sam Adams doesn't taste as good as Guinness, but it's cheaper. And then you've got, at the other end of the extreme, Budweiser that kind of tastes like, tap water, but it's really cheap, right? And you got other things like this. And so this is the consumer. This is what the consumer's aware of. Think of it as a map of the consumer's mind, the information that's there. And what the consumer does, this is taking all the brands and knocking them down. The consumer looks for similarities, and you don't do this consciously. You do it subconsciously. So I can watch your behavior and tell you this is what's going on, but you're doing it at a gut level. You're not consciously aware of what you're doing. What you're doing at a gut level is you're classifying these things. And you classify them in this example, two types of beers. Let's call it the beers with more taste. You might think of them as imports, maybe, and the beers that are more affordable. And we put these into two groups. The technical term for these is cluster, but they're just groups, right? Groupings in your mind. The beers that taste better and the beers that are more affordable. And one of the interesting heuristics here, and businesses have used this heuristic against consumers. One of the heuristics is if you increase the number of brands in a cluster, the probability of the consumer considering that cluster will go up. And this makes sense if you think about it, because the way you would, at a gut level, the way this would feel to you is you're going out to buy beer and you're thinking to yourself, should I get the cheap stuff or should I splurge and get the better stuff, right? That's what's in your head. That's these two clusters, the cheap stuff, the better stuff. And you're thinking about this, and you recall an ad you saw for a new beer, and you recall that's the same beer that a friend of yours mentioned he tried. And somebody else said something about this beer, and it comes in some new colored bright neon can that stands out from all the others. And what's just happened? In your mind, all of a sudden, that affordable cluster just got bigger. It got more things in it, because all of a sudden there's this extra item in here that's kind of impinging on your mind. It's calling it. It's like the guy at the voting booth handing you the hat with the candidate's name on it. It brings it to mind. And so what happened here, and this happened maybe 30 years ago, Miller Genuine Draft, who you see their brand there, MGD, they came out with this new brand, Red Dog. And what was interesting about Red Dog is it had no Miller name on it. It just came out as Red Dog. And so if you weren't paying attention, this looked like it was a whole new company that came out. In fact, they had these trucks that had the bulldog face and they were painted red and they're all over the place. And that's exactly what they were doing. They were putting in people's mind, hey, there's this new brand in this affordable beer grouping. Analysts at the time said that Miller was making a huge mistake coming out with this new brand of Red Dog, because the analysts said, and this kind of makes sense if you think about it, the analysts said, look, all you're going to do here is siphon business off of your flagship brand, Miller Genuine Draft. That's all you're going to do is siphon business off of your flagship brand. So the analysts were saying, at the end of the day, all that will have happened is you would have spent money launching a new brand and you're going to have the same revenue you had before. But that's not what happened. What happened is sales of Miller Genuine Draft, their flagship brand, went up. They went up because Miller was aware that people used this heuristic, even if the consumers weren't aware of it themselves. Miller knew that consumers use this heuristic of if they see more brands in this affordable cluster, they'll tend to buy more beers in the affordable cluster. Exactly like the candidate handing you the hat with the name on it. And you go in, you say, oh, I recognize that, I'm going to buy it. Now, does everybody act that way? No, they don't. We're all different. We all do different things. But the beer company doesn't care about how you personally act. What the beer company cares about is how the people act in general. And if on average, it's causing people to be more apt to buy their flagship brand, this is good news for them. Give you another example. This is with ice cream brands. And again, you can think about, if you think about buying ice cream, there are basically two things that matter, right? There's lots of things that matter, but two big things that rise to the top. One is taste. You want ice cream that tastes good. And the other is you want it to be healthy, right? And everybody knows there's a bit of a trade-off there, right? Because the more healthy it is, it's going to have less sugar. It's not going to taste as good. But these are the two types of ice cream people tend to think about. And here again, we have a consumer, and in the consumer's mind, The consumer is aware of these various brands of ice cream, and the consumer maybe subconsciously divides these into two groups. The premium ones that are, have more calories, but they taste better. And then the healthier ones that kind of taste like plastic, but you're not going to get fat, right? This is a thing. So let's suppose that we've gone through step one, the consideration. The consumer has decided, I'm going for the premium ice cream this time. So we're through consideration. We're now going to talk about choice. How does the consumer go about making a choice? Well, here too, the consumer is going to rely less on heuristics here, but still there are some heuristics the consumer will employ. And if you think about your own behavior, I bet you have done this, where here you are, you're thinking about ice cream and you say, I'm going to get the good stuff this time. And you're aware of three brands. One of them's Breyers, and Breyers, of the brands you're aware of, the premium ice cream, Breyers tastes the best. And there's Haagen-Dazs, which also a premium brand, very good, not as good as Breyers, but it is lower calorie, it's more healthy. And as you think about these things, you're aware of your own ignorance. What I mean by that is you're aware that there are hundreds of brands of ice cream out there, many of which you've never heard of. So if you know there are many hundreds of brands of ice cream out there, you could imagine somewhere out there, maybe, there's an ice cream that has the taste of Breyers, but the low calories of Haagen-Dazs. And that's the ideal. Go back to significant others, because you have probably done this, and you have probably done it consciously, where you've gone through life to be as old as however you are now, and you probably dated a few people, and you think to yourself, yeah, that person I dated 2 years ago had a wonderful sense of humor, but my God, was completely unreliable. And the person I dated last year was much more reliable, a really serious person, but my God, boring as toast. And you think to yourself, somewhere, for God's sake, somewhere out there, there's got to be somebody who is as fun, as lively as that person I dated 2 years ago, and yet is also a serious person like the person I dated last year. In your mind, you have created the ideal. And with that ideal in your mind, you now use it as a comparison. You look around at other people out there and you say, how close does this person come to my ideal? And the closer the person comes to your ideal, the more likely you are to want to date that person. So too here with the ice cream. Now, ice cream is not nearly as important, but the same kind of thing will go on, that you have this sense of the ideal. The ideal is something with the taste of Breyers and the calories of Haagen-Dazs, and certainly somewhere out there has got to be something that has that ideal. And so the heuristic that people will tend to use is the closer a particular brand is to the ideal, the more likely the consumer is to choose that brand. And so you see Ben & Jerry's here, and Ben & Jerry's is, kind of far away from this ideal point. Ben & Jerry's, this would have been about 15 years ago. Ben & Jerry's was aware of this. Ben & Jerry's knew that when consumers who were interested in buying premium ice cream went to buy premium ice cream, that they, in their heads, they had this model that you see here. Not consciously, but kind of at a gut level. This is what Ben & Jerry's knew was going on with consumers. And so Ben & Jerry's did a brilliant thing. They violated one of the prime rules of advertising. One of the prime rules of advertising is don't emphasize your weak points. If your brand has some weak point, some negative, you don't talk about it. You talk about your brand's positives. Ben & Jerry's violated that. They came out with an ad campaign, and the ad campaign said, yes, Ben & Jerry's is a high-calorie ice cream. That was their negative. But then they went on to say, but calories is the price of great taste. Now, what did they just do? With that ad campaign, they were attempting to convince consumers that this ideal that the consumer had in mind, the taste of Breyers and the low calories of Haagen-Dazs, that ideal didn't exist. They were trying to convince the consumer that if you want great taste, you're going to have to put up with more calories. And if you want low calories, you're going to have to deal with less taste. So if you were to draw a picture of what Ben & Jerry's did, they pushed in the consumer's mind that ideal point backward. They pushed it backward toward Ben & Jerry's. And so as people go out there and they say, boy, I wish I could find something with the taste of Breyers and the calories of Haagen-Dazs. And they say, well, and they remember this ad. And they say, yeah, well, that probably doesn't exist because calories is the price of great taste. And they suddenly realize, well, you know, I might not be able to get the ideal, but Ben & Jerry's probably comes closest to what is possible. And indeed, when Ben & Jerry's came out with this ad campaign, their market share went up significantly. Why? Because they were playing, they knew that consumers were using this heuristic, even if the consumers didn't know themselves. And they played off of that heuristic, which enabled them to increase market share. All right, so these are heuristic shortcuts that we use because we simply don't have enough information to make perfect decisions. But here's the thing, heuristics are imprecise, and because they're imprecise, they will cause you to make choice errors. You will make the wrong decisions from time to time. And these things, these errors, we call them cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are what arises when you use a heuristic and you end up making the wrong choice. Not because the heuristic is flawed. Well, the heuristic is what it is. It's better than making a random choice, but it's not perfect. It's not like pure information. And so you'll make errors. So let's talk about some of these biases that you can make. An anchoring bias is one. And with an anchoring bias, you choose a thing because it's the last thing you saw. Again, the candidate handing you the hat with his name on it, right? That's the last thing you saw, so that's the thing you buy. Or you saw the ad for this particular brand of beer and you go to the store and you pick it up because that's the last thing that you remembered. This is anchoring bias. Sometimes it can help you. Sometimes it might not. I'll show you an example of when it might not. This is an experiment I do with my students when they're in person. I can't do it with you because you're all remote. But what I'll do is I will tell half the students in the room, I say, put your heads down, don't look at the screen. In the other half of the room, I say, read this. And they read this, and you can see the per capita GDP of Luxembourg is $118,400. And then I ask them, what's the per capita GDP of the world? And I tell them, go ahead and write down your best guess. What's the per capita GDP of the world? So write down something. Then I say to this group, okay, put your heads down. And the other group, put your heads up and look at this. Read this and answer the question. So they read this and it says the per capita GDP of Morocco is $7,300. What's the per capita GDP of the world? I said, go ahead and write down your answer. Best guess. What's the per capita GDP of the world? And they write down their answers. And what happens, of course, it doesn't happen with everybody, but it happens on average. On average, the people who see the Luxembourg, they tend to overestimate world per capita GDP. And the people who see the Morocco, they tend to underestimate the world per capita GDP. What's happening? This is an anchoring bias. The last number I showed you, when I show you Luxembourg, it's a very high number. And so your tendency is, when I ask you what's the per capita world GDP, your tendency is to give me a higher answer because the last number you saw was a big one. And so too with Morocco, when I show the other group, Morocco, which is a very low number, and I ask them what's a world per capita GDP, they'll tend to answer with a lower number because the last number they saw was this. And if you're interested, the correct answer is $10,400. And again, it's not in every case, but it's not every case that matters. It's the average of the cases that matter. On average, the anchoring bias causes the people to adjust their answers. They latch on to this last thing they saw. And you will see this if you've ever bought a car. And when you do eventually go to buy a house, the realtors will do the same thing the car dealers do. You'll walk in the door and you'll say something like, I'm looking for a car. I don't want to spend more than $20,000. Or you say, I'm looking for a house. I don't want to spend more than $200,000. The very first thing they will show you is something that costs more than the number you just said. And so the car dealer will show you, look, and he won't tell you the price, right? He'll show you this car. He'll say, this car is top notch. It's wonderful. It gets great gas mileage, has leather seats, it has surround sound and sunroof, and it's self-driving and all this stuff he's going to tell you. He's going to get you excited about this car. And then you're going to keep asking, what's the price? What's the price? What's the price? And finally he says, well, this one goes for $50,000. Now he knows darn well you're not going to buy it because you just said you didn't want to spend more than 20. But what he just did is he anchored you. In your head now is that number 50,000. So the next car he shows you is not going to be a $50,000 car, but it's not going to be a $20,000 car either. It's going to be a $30,000 car. And when you see that $30,000 car, you're going to breathe a sigh of relief because in your mind, you got 50,000. And by comparison, the $30,000 car looks a heck of a lot better. And you're much more likely to buy it than you would if he had shown you the $20,000 car first. Anchoring bias. We have this tendency to grab on to the last thing we saw and make that the norm, and we now react to this. Confirmation bias. You choose a thing because it conforms to your preconceptions, and availability bias. You choose a thing because it's more readily available. I'll show you both of these things in an experiment. So I'm showing you on the left, there's a bunch of numbers, a factor and an outcome. Think of it like a cause and an effect. So there's a cause and effect. We've got this thing when the factor's 15, the outcome's 15. When the factor's 5, the outcome's 5.1. So it's data over there on the left. On the right is a different phenomenon, and it's got data too. And you can see when the factor is 19, the outcome is 0.9. When the factor is 10, the outcome is 5. So I show you these two data sets, and I ask you, which of these two data sets is more highly correlated? Is the factor more highly correlated with the outcome over there on the left, or is the factor more highly correlated with the outcome over there on the right? And what happens here is, I'll put this up on the screen and ask the students, take a few minutes to look at these two things. Tell me what you think. We're not doing any calculations here. I'm just asking your gut reaction, right? And students will look at this, and I know what's going through their heads. They look over there on this one, they see a 19 and a 0.9. You say, well, those two numbers are really different. 10 and 5, those numbers are pretty different. And 14 and 4.2, those numbers are really different. Boy, the correlation over here can't be high because these numbers are really different. And then they'll go over there and they'll look at the numbers on the left. They'll see 15 and 15. Those are the same. And then they'll see 5 and 5.1. I say, well, those aren't the same, but man, they're pretty close. And then they'll see 19 and 18.9. See, those are pretty close. And 12 and 12.3 and 1 and 1.0. Oh my God, this is the correlation between the factor and the outcome over here on the left must be really high. And then to check themselves, I know what the students will do. They'll jump down to the end of the list and they'll look there. It's a 7 and 7.0. That's the same. 8 and 7.9. And what's happening? What's happening is the students saw a few numbers there that matched up. And they start looking for more numbers that match up. And as every time they see numbers that match up, they're more and more convinced that this data on the left, this has a very high correlation. What's happening is a confirmation bias. What the students are not paying attention to are all those numbers. Those numbers, the factor and the outcome, are markedly different. Now, what will happen is, I'm not saying they don't see them. I'm saying that by the time their eyes come down to those numbers, they'll write them off. They'll see like the 6 and the 9.9, say, okay, yeah, they're not the same, but they're both, they're both positive numbers, and I don't expect these to match up perfectly anyway. And notice what you're doing. You're making excuses for these numbers that don't fit your preconception. That's confirmation bias. The student has already made his decision and now is looking for information subconsciously, right? You're not doing it consciously. Subconsciously looking for information that confirms the decision he's already made. And if you'd like to see it, that's the data on the left, has an R-squared of 0.3. The data on the right is an R-squared of 1.0. It's a perfect relationship. And here's another bias. We call it the availability bias, and that is simple relationships are easy to perceive. Complex relationships are not. It's much easier to pick up on a straight line relationship, kind of like what you have over on the left. It's much more difficult to pick up on that complex curved relationship that you get on the right. And so both these things are at play here: the confirmation bias, the availability bias, the tendency to focus on things that you agree with, and availability, your tendency to perceive simple relationships more easily. So, a couple examples of these. Confirmation bias: when you are in love, you readily notice a person's positive attributes, but not the negative ones, right? So you've just met somebody and you're madly in love, and your friends are telling you this person is no good for you, right? This is not a good. And what do you say? You say, you don't know this person like I do. You don't see what I do. What are you doing? You're admitting to a confirmation bias, that you're seeing the bits of information that confirm the decision you have already made, and you're minimizing the observations that conflict with the decision you've already made. Availability bias: you're econ students, so you've studied the minimum wage. You know the argument that minimum wage actually makes people worse off, actually particularly makes low-skilled, low-educated, low-experienced workers worse off. But it's hard to convince people of that. And part of the reason it's hard to convince people of that is because of availability bias. It's much easier to get my head around the premise that if I raise the minimum wage, people will earn more money. That's a simple relationship that can easily make sense to me. The more complex relationship is, as I raise the minimum wage, I make it more expensive for employers to hire workers, and therefore employers will hire fewer of them, and therefore those workers' incomes will actually drop. That's a complicated thing. It's more difficult to get my head around. And the availability bias says I will tend to gravitate toward the answer that's easier to understand. And so this is why actually you find many of the things you study in economics, while they make sense once you understand the economics, it's difficult to communicate them to people who haven't studied economics because of availability bias. People's tendency is to grab onto the simple explanation. Aggregation bias: what's true of the group isn't necessarily true of the individuals. I'm going to show you a beautiful example of this. So here we have, this is a hypothetical. This is 2010, and I have a community of 10 people. Person 1 is 90 years old. Person 2 is 80 years old. All the way down, person 9 is 10 years old, and person 10 was just born yesterday. That's my community in 2010. Now, I'm going to roll time forward a decade. It's now, I'm sorry, I'll tell you, the average age here, take the average is 45 years old. So all those people, average age 45. Now, roll the calendar forward 10 years. It's now 2020. What happens? That person, a new person is born, person 11, he was born yesterday. Person 10, he was born 10 years ago. It's now 10 years later, so he's 10 years old. Person 9, he was 10 years old a decade ago. He's now 20. All these people aged, except for person 1. Person 1 died. He's gone. And I ask you, what's the average age of my community of people here? The average age is 45. Another 10 years goes by, and person 12 is born. Person 11, who was born 10 years ago, is now 10 years old. Person 10, who was 10 years old a decade ago, is now 20. We go all the way up. Person 2 has died of old age. Person 3 is now 90 years old. And I ask you, what's the average age of my community? The average age of my community is 45. Now, look at my community over these 3 decades. In every single decade, the average age of my community is 45. That's an aggregation bias. Here's how it works. There's an apparent contradiction here. On the one hand, the average age of my community is the same. It's 45, it's 45, it's 45. So if you look at the average, it would appear that nobody has aged. And yet, every single person here aged. Every 10 years that goes by, each person ages 10 years. And so I've got this weird contradiction. Individually, Each person ages, but the average age doesn't change. That's an aggregation bias. What's true of the whole, the average of all the people, is not true of the individuals. And if you want a beautiful example of this, I give you median workers' wages and salaries. What you're seeing here is the wages and salaries of the median worker, the guy in the middle. It's adjusted for inflation. This is the picture that politicians will point to when they say things like, here's the problem with our economy, that the median worker's wage hasn't changed over the past 30, 40 years. And you look at that and it's kind of flatline, is going up a little bit, but it's basically flatlined. You look at this and say, hey, there's a problem here. The median worker's wage today is not much different than it was in 1979. Except what you're seeing is an aggregation bias. In the same way that as time goes by, the old people die and new young people are born, and because of that, everybody ages, even though the average age remains 45. So too here, over time, what happens? New people come into the workforce as new workers, and they're earning a low wage because they have little experience, little education, right? All of this. They come in at a low wage. Over time, they earn more and more, and eventually they retire, and when they retire, they drop off. We no longer count them. And so, if I aggregate them all up, it looks like the median wage hasn't changed over time. But if I separate the people out, what you see is the blue line. The blue line tracks people who entered the workforce in 1979. And you can see their wages go up, they 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 keep on going up, and then eventually they retire and they leave. The blue line is like the individual ages of the people. Every decade, the people age. The red line is the aggregation. It's like the average age is 45. And so you've got this weird thing with aggregation bias that, yes, it is correct that the median wage hasn't changed in the past 30 some years, but not everybody, but most people's wages have been going up over that time. What's true of the aggregate, what's true of the group, isn't true of the individuals. And then finally, observation bias. What you're most likely to see may not be the most common. You've probably seen this, particularly if you've had a stats class. Stats professors love to show this picture. This is a picture of marking bullet holes on Allied planes that returned from raids over Germany in World War II. This is a real thing. At the time that they were looking at the planes that came back from bombing raids over Germany, World War II, and they looked at where the holes were in the aircraft to figure out what parts of the aircraft should we reinforce with armor. And you look at that picture, you say, okay, what parts of the aircraft should I reinforce with armor? And your tendency is to say, well, we got to reinforce the places where the holes are, because that's where the planes are getting shot. That's the wrong answer. That answer suffers from an observation bias. The planes that they observed were planes that came back from the bombing raids. The planes they weren't observing are the planes that got shot down. And what do we know about the planes that came back from the bombing raids? Very few bullet holes in the cockpit and very few bullet holes on the engines. The place to reinforce with armor is the engines in the cockpit, exactly where you don't see the bullet holes here. Observation bias can lead you to make the wrong decision because you're unaware that the thing you're looking at is not common of the things you're trying to think about. So the conclusion here, look, consumer choice can be costly, particularly in a monopolistically competitive environment. You're dealing with thousands of potential products. You've got to choose one. It becomes impossible to make a perfect decision. And so what do? We understand that, yes, the better choice is good, but the cost of making the choice is bad. And so we rely on heuristics. Heuristics will help me not make a perfect choice, but a better than random choice at low cost, because the heuristics aren't cognitively expensive. And typically when I do this, particularly for expensive things like cars and houses, I do this two-step process of whittling down my thousands of options to something manageable, and I think about the manageable thing. And you have to be aware that there's a downside to heuristics because they're imprecise. they can lead you down into biases, the anchoring bias, the availability bias, confirmation bias, all sorts of situations in which you make what appears to be a good decision based on a heuristic, but it actually ends up being a bad one. So, moral of the story here. In the face of monopolistic competition, absolutely rely on heuristics because it's not worth it to think about all the options, but be aware that the heuristics aren't perfect, that you will make mistakes, but that's the joy of a market environment. You make mistakes, you learn from them, you do better next time. And if you have enjoyed this, I have a podcast I highly recommend you, Words and Numbers, and I have this cool book that you can get on Amazon, Cooperation and Coercion, where I talk about things like this, things that are relevant to economics that are also happening in the real world.